Hello, welcome to PCAP's Prairie's Got the Goods Week. My name is Caitlin Rose, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. This afternoon, Dr. John K. Pattison-Williams from the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Society, Faculty of Agriculture, Life and Environmental Sciences at the University of Alberta will be talking about wetlands, flood control, and ecosystem services in the Smith Creek Drainage Basin, a case study in Saskatchewan. Check out other events going on for our Prairie's Got the Goods Week. Tomorrow at noon, Dr. Edward Bork from the University of Alberta will be talking about does livestock grazing regulate soil carbon in northern temperate grasslands? And don't miss a presentation by Jessica Grenke, PhD student from the University of Alberta, about the influence of grazing management on plant community diversity and production across Western Canada. This is happening on Friday at 3:00 p.m. To register for these webinars or to see other upcoming events, please visit the PCAP website, www.pcap-sk.org. Prairie's Got the Goods Week is presented by Crescent Point Energy and SaskPower, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada. We appreciate the ongoing support from Wildlife Habitat Canada. We would like to note that the primary source of funding for this grant program is from the purchase of the Canadian Wildlife Habitat Conservation Stamp, also known as the Canadian Duck Stamp, by waterfowl hunters. In addition, in-kind support for today's webinar has been given by Pattison Resource Consulting. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. I'm very happy to introduce to you today's presenter, Dr. John K. Pattison-Williams. He is a researcher from the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology at the University of Alberta and president of Pattison Resource Consulting Limited, a company specializing in the interaction between environmental conservation and economic development. John holds a doctorate in natural resource management from the Natural Resources Institute, NRI, at the University of Greenwich, a Master of Science in Agricultural Economics from the University of Alberta, and a Bachelor of Science from Augustana Faculty of the University of Alberta. John is active in consulting and volunteer roles internationally and in Western Canada as Director of the Biodiversity and Research Grants Program of the Alberta Conservation Association and has served on the boards of Battle River Watershed Alliance and Alberta Conservation Association. He has volunteered for committees of the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture and Alberta Beef Producers. John maintains an active research and teaching schedule and is a professional agrologist. He and his spouse Naomi are active on the family farm near Kingman, Alberta. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to John.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, let me just get the screen up and running. All right. Hopefully everyone can see that. And I apologize in advance for the length of my name and the department that I work for and the university faculty that I'm with. That can fill up a bit of time at the start of a presentation. So thank you all so much for calling in and listening this afternoon, and also to Caitlin and everyone at the PCAP for having me. So as I begin, I wanted to start with just a little statement or quote, is that if you want something done on time, get a consultant to do it. But if you want to get something done deeply, well, get an academic. And I don't make that statement to disparage either of those two groups, but more to say that each community has its purpose. And part of my vision, I guess, from my work and my life is to try to bridge some of those two worlds, that of the academic community and yet linking with consulting on issues of research importance and environmental and social importance in Alberta and Canada, and yeah, really across the world. As Caitlin said, I grew up on a farm in rural Alberta and dealt with many of the issues of water on the landscape and biodiversity, runoff in the spring, and it's quite exciting actually to be sort of back and working in this field and locally again. So I'd like to speak today on wetlands, flood control, and ecosystem services in the Smith Creek Drainage Basin in Saskatchewan. This is an example, I believe, of what a consulting job that I'm doing with Pattison Resource Consulting can really bring to the table for working with academic and university organizations. I was funded through Ducks Unlimited Canada, but then collaborated with John Pomeroy and his team from the University of Saskatchewan. And we recently published this book, or this paper, or last year in the journal Ecological Economics. So a couple of themes I'd like to remind us of as we start sort of driving forces for some of this work into conservation across the prairies, wetland conservation or grassland upland conservation. And as to why I've gotten into more the economic side and for ecosystem services. First is that agricultural lands and the natural spaces provide important ecosystem services to all Canadians, and yet they are often neglected or not accounted for when natural resource wealth is calculated or determined and made in decision-making from policymakers. So I want us to think too, how can we create frameworks that account for this wealth in whatever provincial context we are in? And what type of data is required to inform those decisions? The second point is that sustaining these wildlife resources and ecosystem services, it really requires the support of the stakeholders on the land, the farmers, the ranchers, and the rural communities that populate the human communities across this landscape. And so I really think throughout this work and the work that I'm doing is to try to establish some common language or decisions, not just between consulting and academics or farmers and environmentalists, but just trying to get a conversation going with some of these landowners that are, I do believe, serious conservationists, but know that complex choice of actually needing to make a livelihood off the landscape too. So I want us to think about both those things, both how do we account for natural ecosystem services, the benefits from the land that we receive as humans, and then also how do we engage with the stakeholders on the land? Because I think those are two very important sort of background questions for all of us, regardless of whether we are researchers or working for municipal governments or living and farming on the land. So today I'm going to use this subject and this paper to try to convey one approach to doing that. And so I will go through a bit of an environmental issue, or the issue on the landscape and our research questions, then the methodology that we use to answer those questions, share some results, and then conclusions and next steps of I think where we could possibly go from here. So let me go to the first slide. So a very present environmental problem across the prairie provinces, and indeed globally, is the loss of wetlands. In the prairies, these potholes exist across the landscape and they're formed due to glaciation, and they've provided habitat, rich habitat for centuries. And yet with the settlement of the prairies and the advent of agriculture, and especially expanding scale agriculture, there has been a serious movement to drain them. And of course, drainage was heralded as a success for many agricultural producers in the mid to late 1900s, which has led to approximately, give or take, 80% of these wetlands being lost. And I completely understand and have grown up in a farming community where my grandparents and neighbors and less so my parents, but the older generation was really gung-ho about drainage. And so I do understand it, and I've paddled down many a drainage ditch in my life, but they have also led to some serious issues. And this loss continues today. A related problem is the flooding that comes from that activity, the drainage activity. The very low topographical relief and that arose from such glaciation characterizes much of Saskatchewan, especially the region that we're looking at, and has meant the southern regions of the province are particularly susceptible to flooding events, specifically from snowfall and drainage at this time of year, where we see temperatures shooting up in the last couple of weeks in Alberta, anyway from -20 or 30 up to +18 in the last few days. And you can just see that snow melting, and it's going somewhere. That moisture is going somewhere. And so with advanced drainage networks and more frequency of, I would say, extreme weather events, I would argue due to climate change, we are seeing some of the wettest years on record, and also some of the higher flood situations are happening. For example, as those of you in Saskatchewan will know, in 2010 there was a record number of acres unseeded, about 8 million, and drowned out, about 4 million, due to high moisture conditions. And of course, that led to situations like you see in the first slide, the intro slide, of flooding across roadways, damaged roads, and many farmers, as well as acreage owners and small towns across the prairies, really faced high damage and associated insurance costs from those effects. And there have been significant financial resources required to compensate for those damages that have happened. We see that from private insurance, provincial and federal governments, and also public expenditures on roadworks, dikes and dams. And I'm just looking here, in 2011, the payouts for federal disaster payouts were approximately 245 million, and ranging 245 million to 160 million in 2014. And the thing is that according to the models, and I think the previous presenter spoke on climate change across the prairies, some of the models are projecting that this will increase in the future. And the exacerbated problem is that of phosphorus and nitrogen that are also coming, being swept off the landscape into waterways. And many lakes and rivers and streams across the prairies are having to deal with this higher nutrient load. And so that leads us to sort of, okay, we have these wetlands and they're being drained, and this is causing these issues to occur. At the same time has risen sort of a field of study that I think has become more common in sort of the vernacular of many researchers and people around, even farmers around Prairie Canada, is that of ecosystem services. It can be viewed with great joy or great disdain, depending upon your perspective. My position is there's some real opportunity here, that it can speak in a language that is accessible to decision makers as well as landowners, and maybe is part of a step towards understanding how our environmental ethic can align with some of our financial and economic development wants or needs even. And so across the prairies, I think you see that in many environmental organizations or even governments have acknowledged the value of wetlands through wetland policies. In Saskatchewan, had one of the first wetland policies in 1995. It has been adapted and is working through to this day. Alberta has recently adopted a wetland policy. And not always explicitly, but indirectly, there is reference to these benefits of wetlands and these ecosystem services that come. And so that's kind of where I'm coming at it today, is that one, I think a weakness is that many of these reports and these projects and these, as you can see on the assessment here, these benefit studies show both the impacts, which can be quite severe, but also the benefits of wetlands alone. And they often put dollar figures on them, and that is good. but I think not as often are they contrasted and complemented by the costs that are very much part of these decisions that landowners make. There are opportunity costs and restoration costs to wetlands. And I think it's important to try to marry those with sometimes within the similar document, and that actually helps for decision makers and sort of informed decisions to be made. So that's what I'm trying to do today, and specifically asking two questions. One, do wetland ecosystems in this area, that is Smith Creek, present a viable financial option to mitigate the impacts of flood events in Saskatchewan specifically, and in the Canadian Prairie Pothole region in general? So the first one is flooding alone. And the second is wetland conservation an economically viable solution to address other environmental issues in Saskatchewan specifically, and in the Canadian Prairie Pothole region in general. So that expands it to think of the other, not flooding alone as an issue, and not flooding alone as the sole benefit of wetlands. But this second point expands our discussion to understand more the social benefits of wetlands. So this is our research area. I'll speak in sort of the collective we approach here. Yeah, this is the Prairie Pothole region. And as you can see, in just near the Saskatchewan and Manitoba border is the Smith Creek Research Basin. And so it's that little blue spot down there. And this is an area that has seen what was considered by my colleagues to be representative in a way of what areas and basins in that part of Saskatchewan and Manitoba look like. As you can see, there has been significant drainage that has occurred from these two scenarios from 1958 through till 2009. On the left, the orangish red color represents, well, in both, they represent wetlands, and the blue represents drainage works. And so you can really see the blue veins really popping out in the graph on the right and the figure on the right. And you can see that that's, yeah, there's been a lot that has happened during that time. And so this is one of those issues, I guess, that we're trying to look at. Our methodology, as I spoke earlier, oh, sorry, let me just go back for a moment, if that's all right. There was a point I wanted to make as well, is that there's been a dramatic shift in the sources of runoff from this area in Smith Creek as well since the 90s. Around 1990, about 85% of the stream flow volume came from snowmelt and runoff, and the peaks occurred in March to May. And then the stream often dried up. Smith Creek dried up in late May. And since 2009, however, the rainfall is involved in more of this stream flow and has led to peak flows in 2012 and 2014. So again, and as a result, this is what John Pomeroy's team was looking at. The runoff efficiency in the basin increased 12-fold over this period. So you think that that efficiency of getting the water off the land, which does have benefit for getting crops in the field, that has also just really increased the efficiency, and those blue networks are doing their job. So that's the situation, that's our study area. And now posing what sort of model or approach to look, sort of our methodology is how we tackle this problem. And this, in general, is a very multidisciplinary approach. I'm trained somewhat in some of the sort of the biophysical science field, but my particular area is in economics and business decision making. And so I'm not the guy that you want to go model the number of wetlands on a landscape, or to test how fast the water is going off the land, or what sort of nutrients are being removed. So I had to rely on colleagues and friends from Ducks Unlimited. Think of Pascal, who you heard earlier. Think of Lyle Boychuk. And then the team from the University of Saskatchewan, John Pomeroy's lab, was very helpful in exploring some of the hydrology behind it. So I used what they were bringing out to inform the economic benefits that accrue from those services, those ecosystem services. And we'll kind of get into that in a couple slides, but of course this is a difficult and somewhat I don't say controversial, but it's difficult to really put a financial value on these services. One, because there's no market. Two, because the research is very expensive and time consuming. Think if you really need some academics in the field or some researchers that are devoting a lot of time to understand these services. So we'll talk a little bit about that after. And then equally, it's the cost of keeping these wetlands on the landscape and then of restoring them are also quite complex to understand. But once we found those, and I'll share that in a moment, then we conducted a flood return on investment and then a social return on investment. And then at the end, we compared those two scenarios to hopefully inform some decision making regarding water on the landscape. So as one of those thrilling students of the dismal science of economics, just put a very gentle equation up for you. This is sort of the present value calculation and just of costs here, but we do at the present value of benefits and of the costs is simply the sum over a time period t over the cost, and the discount rate is R. So you can kind of get an idea of what your investment means over time. And by comparing the benefits and the costs, dividing them by each other, you can, the decision rule is 1. If the ratio of cost to benefits is less than 1, then it doesn't really make financial sense to follow a certain course of action. But if it's greater than 1, it shows it has an investment with some returns that are good or things you can think about that are positive. And I'll get into each of these in the next few slides, but in summary, the benefits that I included in this equation were the flood control benefit, nitrogen removal, phosphorus removal, some proxy for recreation that just came around from hunting estimates for waterfowl hunting on the land. And then another big one is the carbon impacts and the carbon value. I guess again a somewhat controversial policy federally and provincially, but when we're looking at the tax on carbon, it actually provides a nice baseline to estimate the costs and the benefits of carbon sequestration from these ecosystems. So the benefits are the either individually flooding in the first model or a summation of all of those. The cost determination is divided into 2. So the total cost of having a wetland are the opportunity cost of having it on the land and the restoration cost. Now, in kind of counterintuitively, for those that aren't sort of haven't been spent a lot of time in sort of economics literature or books, it's thrilling stuff, but not for everyone. The term opportunity cost is simply the next best alternative, or what you could be doing with the land other than what's actually you're currently managing it for. And so if you take it off, if you keep a wetland on a field, say of canola or wheat, you're giving up the income that you could earn by draining it and getting some bushels of canola off it, or grazing it for pasture or wheat or what have you. And so there is a vast and diverse literature on how to calculate true opportunity costs for these agricultural landscapes. That wasn't the focus of this paper, and so what I used and is a proxy for that is the rental rates in Saskatchewan. I believe it was in 2016 per hectare. So if you're sort of confused by that large number, it's not per acre, it's per hectare. And then the restoration costs are were provided by Dixon Limited Canada, who does a lot of the restoration in this area and have a good solid understanding of what their costs are. They are an initial one-time expenditure that includes all the labor, the ditching, the ditch plugs, the seeding of the grass or what have you around the wetland, the restored wetland. And they also include some future management costs. So that estimate seems quite high, but is a very complete and sort of holistic understanding of what it does cost to restore a wetland out of cropped production. So I'm sure there might be questions on those two estimates later on, and I welcome those. There's sort of an overview right now, but we can go deeper. So the other aspect that was important, we felt, was to give some scenarios of what the restoration could look like, or the wetlands on the landscape could look like. So one scenario is right in the middle, there is existing. So it's retention or keeping the existing wetland area as is. Now that is basically halting all the loss that is currently happening, but not spending anything on restoration. Now, for interest's sake, for comparative purposes, we did 3 restoration scenarios, both 5% of the historic, and historic is defined as the 1958 level shown in those earlier figures, of restoration of 5, 25, or 100% of historic wetland area. I think, 100% is not realistic, but it provides an extreme level of the spectrum that is useful. Equally, we looked at the loss, the ongoing loss of wetlands, and we know this is happening daily, yearly, right now. So if we, again, can kind of see 5% loss of the current wetland area going down to 25 or 100%. Again, acknowledging that 100% loss is not likely, not realistic, but it provides some comparative advantages. So then looking at the flooding return on investment alone, and the reason this was identified or isolated out from the other ecosystem services that wetlands provide is that this was viewed by stakeholders within the province as an important issue at the time we did this paper. I believe it still is. There are, I guess, in any provincial context, these sort of change a little over time. But I think, flooding was identified as the primary issue at this time, so 2 years ago. And so we looked at using Pomeroy's model. We understand some of the regimes of runoff, of flow, and what was happening there. And then that there is an annual discharge and peak daily stream flow, and noting that they have high sensitivity to wetland drainage. And so building on that, and recognizing too that there are no specific values for flood control in this basin, we used a method called benefits transfer. This isn't the gold standard. The gold standard would be to try to get some Smith Creek specific values, but building across the water, the hydrology work that Palmer had done, we could make a pretty solid estimate using an estimate and adjusted for inflation from Brander in 2013, who calculated that a hectare of wetlands and agricultural landscapes in Prairie, Canada, provided approximately $280 per hectare of flood control benefit. And that's building upon some of those things like avoided costs, construction costs, damage for infrastructure, insurance costs. You can check out that paper if you're interested in more details on that. And then this allowed us to be able to calculate on these various scenarios of loss and restoration. You can see the hectares in the second column, the change, so to be a restoration of about 2,200 hectares if we wanted to go back to 1958 levels, a loss of approximately 6,500 if we lose everything. And then you calculate the comparative change in benefit that occurs from all those scenarios. A more easy way to view this is then doing it in a graph format. And I'm looking specifically here at the restoration the retention and restoration scenarios, and I'll deal with the loss scenarios later. So you see for retention, it's done over 1 year, 10 years, and 30 years. And you see that there is a really high return on investment for flooding return on investment for retaining wetlands on the landscape. So about every $3.17 spent, it'll give you, for every dollar spent, you get $3.17 benefit. And you'll note that those three in retention, all three columns, 1, 10, and 30 years are the same, and then they change in the other scenarios. And that is because over time, the other scenarios are looking at restoration. So that includes that $1,300 a hectare restoration cost. And over time, and as that is paid in the initial year, the assumption is that you've got to pay that output, that fixed cost at the start. Over time, that slowly starts paying back. And so you start to see sort of a rising benefit coming after 10 years, and then after 30 years if you get to higher levels of restoration. And then, look at that. There are my 4 points that I should have changed the slide to. So this just simply summarizes what I just said to you. And then because we didn't want to leave it just there, I think that would have been fine for the purposes of our research, but we wanted to explore some of these other benefits as ecosystem services that wetlands also provide. And so that we looked at the social return on investment. Where are we? And so just a couple comparisons. Sorry, I have a, look at that. Thought it was going slightly too smoothly. Just had to move it so I could see what I'd written there. So again, these are the 4 values: the phosphorus, nitrogen, recreation, and carbon, that were then included in an expanded analysis. And so this is arising from research in this area as well, in this watershed, that's looking at if there was 25% of these wetlands lost, there would be a 550 kilogram or 11% increase in the total phosphorus loading to the basin. Again, this would greatly increase if all of them were drained. Again, a counter to that is restoring would retain some of this phosphorus in the basins themselves. And it was calculated that 25% of wetlands would approximately lead to about 2,540 kilograms under full restoration. Similarly, in nitrogen, we look at a couple of scenarios, and you can see how many kilograms would be retained. And then both those estimates of phosphorus and nitrogen were calculated by using the cost to remove phosphorus and nitrogen from a comparable water treatment facility. The other 2 benefits are recreation and carbon. Recreation, again, I mentioned earlier, was somewhat around waterfowl hunting, and of course this is contingent upon demographics and distance from urban centers and population bases. I used a conservative estimate of about $19.60 per hectare annually in this area of Saskatchewan from another study. And then for carbon, knowing that wetland in the PPR contains about 205 tons of carbon per hectare, when they are drained, about 89 tons are lost to the atmosphere. And so this is a real argument to keep them on the landscape, because it takes many, many years for restored wetlands to become the carbon sinks that existing wetlands are. So again, a lot of good work has been done on this by Pascal Badiou, and exploring what's happening with the carbon within wetlands. But using a conservative approach and considering that that drainage leads to a one-time release of about 326 tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare, the retention scenario will retain about 3.25 tons, and then we calculated that, estimated a financial value using the $20 per ton carbon tax. So this shows some of just a table showing some of those calculations of the hectares, the change in hectares, and then what's happening under each scenario. Sorry, I just had a glass of water here. And then we move on to, again, graphically, what happens under this expanded suite, and labeling it a social return on investment. So it makes intuitive sense because now there are other values being included in the benefit calculation that the ratios would increase. And so again, retention then leads to a much higher social return on investment than the others. And I kind of think of this as well, that, you know, this really, again, hammers home the argument that, man, when we lose wetlands, it's hard to get those values back. It takes a long time and a lot of foresight to get that back, which is shown in this table here. Again, and so we see these are the loss scenarios. So under the existing law, the existing scenario, loss of 25, 50, and 100%. So this is sort of the other side of that earlier table. And this is considering still the opportunity costs associated with keeping smaller number of wetlands, diminishing number of wetlands. And the big red bars going into the negative are really hammered home by the loss of carbon and how that one-time release into the atmosphere is quite costly. So this just provides here, this slide, I believe, a good comparison of the two situations. Our flooding return on investment on the left and our social return on investment on the right. As you can see, the scale is comparable, and so you can see there's a lot higher estimates on the right. All right, so just to draw some conclusions, I think we're coming about to the right amount of time, is that in general and overall, we present a financial case that there are benefits to retaining and restoring some wetlands on the Smith Creek Basin and in similar prairie basins across the provincial boundaries in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And investment in the wetland conservation provides a positive social return on investment. This is an important result. I think that's important to take home. And that every $1 Canadian invested in retention leads to about $7.70 in benefits. And of course, and then even for 25% restoration of wetlands, lost wetlands, which is, I think, not, well, maybe it isn't possible, but there are restoration movements, and I think they're important to consider where we can. They also lead to a benefit over time, a positive return on investment, primarily because these ecosystems do mitigate and help with some of the major environmental concerns that we are facing as Canadians, as people from Saskatchewan, like flooding, like water quality concerns, and they're important to us, and that they're having also significant impacts, and we're seeing that on the residents of the province and downstream jurisdictions. I think for those of you in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, I think some of those discussions are, well, and Alberta as well, for wherever we are on sort of the flow of water, those downstream of us are impacted, and quite often negatively, by our practices and our land use upstream. And then finally, I think wetland conservation can assist the government of Saskatchewan meet some of the objectives in their plan for growth. Now, of course, I look forward to questions in a moment, but I want to recognize too that there are obviously more steps to understanding this issue, and that this is simply a not preliminary, but this is I believe an important step in trying to compare the benefits and costs of some of these services and of these ecosystems. But obviously, we need to understand the variability of our phosphorus, nitrogen, and the quantity of water specifically in subbasins like Smith Creek. These benefit transfers, we aren't bringing these estimates across from another continent or even the States. Tried to narrow in so they were Canadian estimates. Nevertheless, it is a costly endeavor to really do the research at a watershed level, and yet it vastly improves the results from these studies. And I don't think it would change the conclusions, but it would provide some finer resolution to them. And the next step, I think, too, is there has been, and maybe continues to be, an expectation amongst many conservationists that once the knowledge is out there about wetlands and the benefits they provide, that the stakeholders or the people or the general public will increasingly demand their protection for the economic benefits and the quality of life. And I would hope that this would be a part of that discussion, but I'm sometimes a little cynical about the ability of the for just the average person to make decisions that when you think there's something as far away, it's hard to really link this wetland, this slough out on a prairie field with your life if you're living in an urban area, for example, or somewhere else. So I think we really want to dig into that again around perspectives of upstream and downstream users, the social dynamics and power dynamics between urban and rural perspectives, and also concerns of private and public property rights. These are issues and discussions that are not unique to wetland conservation. In other work around grasslands or forests or any real sort of public debate, public issue around the use of our natural resources, this is a big one, and we can't simply rely on either the biophysical or the economics knowledge to make our decisions, but understanding the social dimensions and what makes people tick, what makes people make decisions is very, very important to that too. So I really want to think for all of us maybe on this call, but also for myself and other researchers to think about how that dynamic plays out and speak in a way that everyone can understand and hear quite clearly, and hopefully there can be this benefit of wetlands can show the environmental, the social, and the economic benefits to society. All right, I think that's pretty much it from me. I just want to acknowledge funding from BHP Billiton, Prairie Habitat Joint Venture, and Ducks Unlimited Canada. Other colleagues and researchers, Lyle Boychuk, Trevor Plews, Ian Glass, Wanhao Yang, and Longbo Liu for some of their research and some of the Canada Research Chairs programs. Thank you very much, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was an awesome presentation. I've been taking notes like mad over here. I forgot about the screenshot function in the webinar. I guess that would have been handy. I just did it the old-fashioned way.
No worries.
To all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard. And I just want to make a note that when you leave the webinar, a survey will pop up, and I think will also be emailed to you too. If you don't mind taking a minute to fill that out, we would really appreciate that. It helps us report back statistics to our funders so we can keep these webinars going in the future. And John, it looks like we have a few questions here. So the first one is by a listener named Daniel, and he'd like to know what Saskatchewan town is closest to the Smith Creek drainage.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I apologize for that. It's Langford. Langford or Langton? Let me just pull it up here. I don't want to slight any Saskatchewan person here on the call. Yeah, so it's 60 kilometers from Yorkton and southeast of Yorkton, and it includes the town of Langenburg, and it's in the upper headwaters of the upper Assiniboine River Basin. Hopefully that helps. Apologies for not mentioning that.
Thanks for that answer. The next question is from a listener named Dave, and he would like to know the cost of Loss of upland storage to agricultural wetland draining has been acute in some terminal basins, such as Quill Lake, Saskatchewan. How much could be learned about studying these flooding situations that could be applied elsewhere?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think that relationship between wetland loss and also the upland storage is very important. And in fact, I'm working right now on a project looking at some of the more the upland storage and grassland conservation and that interaction between wetlands. So I think it is important, and I think sometimes, probably myself, I've sort of focused a little more on wetlands and somehow haven't looked as much at that interaction between the upland habitat. So trying to remedy that now. Feel free to give me an email if you want to know more about that, or if there's any thoughts you have that could improve my thinking on it as well. Thank you.
Thanks. A listener named Laura would like to know, opportunity cost was an annual figure and restoration cost was a one-time figure. Is that correct? And that one-time cost has future maintenance and management costs built in?
Yeah, thanks, Laura, for that question. Yeah, exactly. So in the model, the restoration cost was a one-time initial cost, but had elements of maintenance that was included from Ducks Unlimited. Sort of staff making sure that no future drainage had happened, just monitoring what was going on the landscape. Whereas the second that wetland was restored, there also comes in an opportunity cost that's also part of the restoration scenarios. So within the model, it's retention for everything, even the restored wetlands. There's a cost that again comes from taking that out of agricultural production. So yeah, it sort of works nicely together in that way, I think. But if you have, hopefully that answers your questions. But if you have further questions, just feel free to give me a shout.
I think so. A listener named Anna has two questions here. What is the policy/legislative context for wetlands in Saskatchewan? Are reports like these important in legislating more wetland conservation measures?
Oh, of course they are. You know, nothing like an academic to make a difference in the policy world. I say that sort of jokingly. I mean, we would hope that this would have a big impact. I think the policy context, and if you look at the paper, I did delve a little bit into that at the end in the discussion component, looking at, Saskatchewan did have a wetland policy, not necessarily, it was a good step from 1995, but that has, there are areas of improvement, and those are underway. I think there's a number of programs that have sort of contained wetlands in Saskatchewan. I don't have them off the top of my head, my apologies. But I think one of the advantages that can come working both with the university, but as well as with organizations like Ducks Unlimited, or even though sometimes Ducks is not a popular group amongst many farmers, I think they have established themselves, and also organizations like the PCAP, so that government officials, bureaucrats, and researchers do have they listen. I do believe to some of these reports, and they read them. And I know I've done similar work for my master's thesis in Manitoba that what did drive some change there. So I don't think I'm being completely naive to state that don't want to take ourselves necessarily too seriously, but the value of a bit of rigor in some of these reports that then is affirmed by the peer review process that I tried to do here is really important, and I think government officials do value that, and so I hope that maybe something can come of it. Thank you.
Thanks. There's a really good question here from a listener named Jeff. He would like to know, or he says, if I understand for every $1 spent on leasing wetlands, $7 of benefit accrue to society. Does it follow that for every $1 worth of wetland rental lost by draining, $7 of damages are imposed on society?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Yes, that is the way the calculation, what it's showing. And that's again, though, and here's where this sort of field of environmental economics is somewhat still isn't, those two questions I said at the start. How do we fit in these ecosystem service values into our economic systems of today? I think we've tried to do that here, but yet there's still a recognition that there's a societal loss that is we can calculate it, and which we've done here, but yet sort of to quantify that in the individual's pocketbook is maybe less tangible still, because there isn't a market. There isn't like a trading market out there for carbon. Well, for carbon there is in some cases, but for nitrogen and phosphorus, or a market for wetlands out there. And I'm not suggesting there needs to be, but I think that that's possibly a good caveat for this work too, is to know that yes, there is value that is coming from it, and we've quantified it based upon the benefits and the costs, but that there's still a missing market in there. And so that kind of limits the ability of this sort of work to really hammer home in our current sort of approach to economics and business. I hope that answers the question. It's a good question, and it's a big one, and it delves into a lot of the theoretical end of things and how the theory moves into just applied work in everyday life. But yeah, love to chat about it more sometime if you're interested, and thank you.
Thanks for that answer, John. One of our listeners, Kristen, would like to know about a recording of this webinar. So I just want to let everyone know that PCAP has a YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/user/skpcap. And a recording of this webinar will be uploaded to our channel later today. And we also have recordings of all the webinars that have been going on for Prairie's Got the Goods Week up there too. And it's under our 2019 Prairie's Got the Goods Week playlist. So you're welcome to check that out. And that looks like all the questions that we have, John. So I guess with that, thank you so much for the fabulous presentation. I really love the number crunching that you've done there, and it really gives a person a good grasp of the importance of wetlands. So thank you so much for your time today.
Sure, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. And again, if anyone wants to send an email and correct me or say good job, anything like that, I have further questions, I'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in today, and hopefully you can catch one of our webinars going on tomorrow. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.